Greetings, friends, and welcome to the 2023 installment of the National Association for Gifted Children's Legacy Archive Project. For the better part of a decade, the Conceptual Foundations Network at NAGC has been formally collecting and cataloging video interviews with influential figures in the field of gifted education, building on interviews obtained since the early 2000s. Historically, the network identifies individual practitioners and researchers and highlights their professional journeys. This year, however, the network is interviewing 4 scholars who constitute not only strong individual contributors to the field, but who also represent a 4-stage legacy, each having studied under the prior researcher. This collection of 4 interviews is intended to highlight the generational nature of thought contribution as it impacts practice. My name is Kristofor Wiley, and I am a member of the Conceptual Foundations Network. I have the great honor today of interviewing the wellspring of this year's collective, Dr. Carolyn Callahan. Carolyn is the Virginia Commonwealth Professor of Education Emeritus at the University of Virginia. She began her work at UVA in 1973 after earning her doctorate at the University of Connecticut under Joe Renzulli, among others. In the decades of hard work since then, she has fundamentally shaped scholarly thought on giftedness and advanced academics through myriad roles. She has served as a principal investigator for the National Research Center on the Gifted and Talented. She has served as editor-in-chief of NAGC's flagship publication, Gifted Child Quarterly, and she was the founder of the Summer Enrichment Program at UVA. In the process, she has been awarded 6 Javits grants at the federal level and has contributed to so many articles and chapters that, frankly, we have lost count. She has also mentored wave after wave of graduate students as they sought to serve gifted learners. Her contributions to the field are in some ways represented in the other interviewees for this year's Legacy Archive. And her focus on promoting student excellence is captured in the NAGC Doctoral Student Awards offered annually in her name, a fitting testament to her impact on emergent scholars. There's a great deal more to be said, but I will leave the remainder to our audience to go ahead and Google. For now, I am eager to move past her powerful biography to her more powerful thoughts for our future. Hello, Carolyn, and my great thanks for taking the time to help us record your thoughts.
Hi, Chris. Good to be here.
So we'll jump on right in. I have only a few questions, but I think you and I will find a way to talk around them as well. So there are, when we graduate from our doctoral programs and start to forge our professional identities, there are a lot of influences on a young scholar's work. But I think it's widely understood that the philosophical frameworks of specific individuals often resonate deeply through that early work. It seems with you as if Joe Renzulli was such a figure for you, initially influencing the direction and the nature of your scholarship. And I wonder if you would take a few minutes and talk a bit about how you perceived Joe's scholarship as you studied together and how you think his work informed your work as you took on your early career.
Well, Chris, I was lucky to start working with Joe at a point in his life where he was involved in multiple endeavors, as I will call them. It was early in his career, and he was working on a number of things that I think probably had a major influence on my thinking. The first of those was I was hired to work for him as a graduate assistant on a federal program called Teaching the Talented, which was a fellowship program for people earning doctorates in the field of underserved populations of gifted students. So they were all minority individuals. 2 of the noteworthy ones that people probably know about are Alexandria Baldwin and Mary Fraser, who came through that program as fellows while I was the graduate assistant. There were numerous others who went on to do really important things in the field, but that emphasis on being concerned about minorities, gifted students from minority populations probably had a major impact in many ways across many areas of study that I ultimately worked in. So there was certainly the concern of many of the individuals in that program and Joe on African-American, Black students and Hispanic students. But in the course of my career, that was expanded into worrying about the underrepresentation of females in advanced placement and in mathematics, which came from my high school teaching experience, where in all of my advanced math classes, there were usually only 1 or 2 females. in the group, which was a concern to me. So that was certainly an underrepresented population. I also expanded into the world of looking at Indigenous populations and the identification of students from various American Indian tribes in the United States. And then I also ultimately was looking at, as part of the National Research Center work, Hispanic students and identification of Hispanic students for gifted programs. And then in the most recent years, that evolved into rural high poverty schools and working in a Javits grant where we focused on the identification of students from rural high poverty students. So the Teaching the Talented program laid the base, I think, for me thinking about students who were not represented in gifted programs. Joe was also working on his book on evaluation of gifted programs, which was the first book on evaluation of gifted programs in our field. And I was lucky enough to be, I would call it his editor on that book. I wasn't sophisticated enough at that time to be making meaningful contributions to content for sure, but I learned a lot from working on the book with him. And obviously a good part of my work throughout my career has been focused on evaluation of the impacts of gifted programs. And I would say that thread was there for my entire career as well. Another thread was he was working with Bob Hartman, who I think was his first doctoral student, on the scales for rating the behavioral characteristics of superior students, the Scripps scales. So because I was an undergraduate math major and was taking computer science courses, I also did a lot of the data analysis for that and got very intrigued with the whole notion of identification of gifted students, which then ultimately get tied back to the underrepresented students. You know, it started out as just what's a scale we can use in general for teachers to identify gifted students, but then became a much bigger issue in terms of who are we identifying? Are we identifying in a just, fair, unbiased way? So I could see that initial work in identification, there were also some scales. You mentioned Jonathan Plucker. Jonathan and I worked on a scale which focused on identifying students from Hispanic populations. There were scales I worked on with Cheryl Adams, where we were validating the Diet Cola test to see how appropriate that was as an evaluation instrument. So the whole evaluation, identification, assessment complex sort of complemented each other in my thinking that came from working with Joe on the Scripps scales. And then one final area that I remember was he was also working at that time on the New Directions in Creativity series. He was very involved in the area of creativity. And so I was a co-author on the third volume of the Creativity Development series. And that laid a foundation with him and with Steve Owen and a couple of other people in my doctoral program on both the development of creativity in classrooms, but also the assessment of creativity, both assessment of creativity for identification and assessment of creativity as an outcome, as part of the whole evaluation complex. So I thought, as I think about what was going on at that time, I was looking at them at that time as 4 discrete projects that I went to work to do. And so I was learning from each of those. I'm a big contender that you learn as much working with your doctoral advisor as you do in the courses that you take in a doctoral program. And I would say that certainly that was true for me in all the opportunities that I had to work with Joe. At that time in his career, when all those things were going on, I was able to benefit by being a graduate assistant involved in each of those projects at one time or another.
That's amazing. That's such a comprehensive spread of concerns and topics surrounding our field. And I'm eager to dig into that and how that grew over the course of your scholarship. But I think my first question is sort of, was there anything he didn't do? Was there anything that you two didn't? Were there other lines of scholarship going on that you were sort of selecting against involving yourself in?
I would say at that particular point in his career and mine, he had not yet evolved to a point where he was talking about the 3-ring conception of giftedness, or the school-wide enrichment model, or the enrichment triad model. Those, I think the enrichment triad model was published in '77, and I had been gone for a number of years. And so at that point in time, I was not, and he was not thinking in terms of program development or curriculum development. Or I think, I'm speculating now and you would probably have to quiz him, but I think the Teaching the Talented program and the work that Alex Zinnia and Baldwin was doing and Mary Fraser was doing and other people were doing in that program were beginning to lay the base for him of thinking about giftedness differently. And probably me too. I was probably, I was in classes with them. I was in many, coffee shop discussions with them about a lot of those things. And so even though they were not happening, and they certainly, I never did much work in curriculum until the last several years of my career. I sort of stayed away from the whole curriculum area. I had enough to do. And I had not had, in my doctoral program, I had not had any courses in curriculum for gifted. I mean, there were none in my program. Joe wasn't working in that area, and he was the only person in gifted at UConn at the time. So it wasn't like other people who were doing curricular work were there. He wasn't pursuing it at that time. I wasn't pursuing it at that time. Later in my life, as I spent a lot of time doing evaluations of programming, getting very frustrated with what people were doing for kids and what wasn't working, I got more intrigued with the area of curriculum development. And later on in, say, the last 10 or 15 years of my career, the development of the clear curriculum model, the units that we developed out of the clear curriculum model were certainly a foray into curriculum. And I have to admit, I did not go into that by myself. I mean, I was working with Amy Azano, who had a really, really strong background in English and curriculum. And I was a math teacher, not a language arts teacher. So I had to learn a lot of language arts and a lot of curriculum in order to do that work. And also one of our NRC projects was very much curriculum based. And Catherine Brighton and Holly Hertberg contributed considerably to teaching me a lot about curriculum. But at that point in my career, when I was a doctoral student, that wasn't an avenue that I thought about pursuing. The other one that I dabbled in later, but probably didn't come out of that work, was social emotional development of gifted students. And again, it involves largely because we had a National Research Center grant that was focusing on that. And I was working with some people in counselor education we were very much concerned that we, in the National Research Center, involve people from other disciplines within education. And so the counselor ed people were working with me on that whole social and emotional development area. But that wasn't a focus of what Joe was doing at the time or what my thinking was at that time.
So that's very interesting. That brings me to another question then. So absolutely, over time, of course, we see significant changes in our scholarship and practice, both as a field and clearly as individuals, right? Our work as a field cycles in and out of public favor, I think, depending on who has done what and whether we're in a war and how money is looking. We are continuing to work to reveal our strengths and weaknesses in whom we serve and how we serve them. And while I hear you talking about changes in what you have looked at in the latter years, I also hear that in the early 70s, you were engaging many of the exact very same topics with which we are struggling now. And I would imagine that at least a few of our emergent gifted resource teachers feel that the struggle to effectively serve demographic diversity is new, when there's nothing like it that's new, right? So there are many questions in there for me. One that I think I want to latch onto, given something you just said, was I hear you saying you engaged curriculum maybe a little bit because of what you saw and a little bit because of having a good colleague, Amy Azano, by your side to help talk about that. And I hear you talking about sort of grant funding, taking you to the clear curriculum in terms of a direction. In speaking with new scholars, what would you say are the factors that change the trajectory of your work over a career of scholarship?
Well, certainly the evolving theory in the field, starting with Joe proposing the 3-ring definition of giftedness and the triad model, which obviously are tied together because the triad model is obviously, and school-wide enrichment model, as he's evolved, have also start with a fundamentally different way of thinking about how large the population is and what characteristics that population brings to bear. The second thing that was going on politically is the realization in many, many school districts, either internally or because outside pressures were coming to bear, that certain populations were grossly underrepresented in gifted programs. And I don't think, sort of can get philosophical about this, I guess. I don't think people in the field are responding because of political pressure, but out of realization that it just wasn't right. That yes, people were bringing pressure to school districts to do something about this, but within the field, I had a sense always that the field was far, far ahead in terms of its recognition of the problem, even though it's not given much credit. If you really go back and read what Sternberg was writing, or Gardner was writing, or Joe was writing, or other people, Alex and Mary Fraser, and the work Scott Hunsaker was doing with Mary Fraser, people were talking about it in the field and trying to make, take steps to make things different. So, you know, Alexenia was pursuing the matrix, and Mary Fraser was pursuing the alternative conceptions of the way giftedness manifests in different populations. That was way back in the 70s. I mean, that wasn't that's not something that just happened in 2010. The sad thing is that the output doesn't seem to be equaling the effort that's going into that. And so I would say there were those political things, which were there was the philosophical, theoretical stuff that was going on with Joe and people who were proposing alternative conceptions of gifted. Those conceptions of gifted allowed for more inclusive thinking about who was gifted and who was not gifted. There were the social pressures in school districts not to have such exclusive elite gifted programs from which kids of poverty or color were excluded. Then there comes a political pressure, which is once people internally start raising those questions, politics at the state level begin to respond. How are we going to fund? Of course, legislation follows or lags way behind what is going on in a field. And so I don't think very many states, or certainly the federal government, has taken, no, I'll back off on that for a minute. The states have not taken a lot of leadership nationally. There have been individual states that have made incredible efforts to try to address that problem, but nationally that has not been the case. The federal government has no legislation for gifted. So the reports that came out at various times would address that issue. And the Javits funding, and even the National Research Center, had specific focus on minority, high poverty, second language learner, all those gifted populations who were not being served. And so the federal government tried to do it through the Javits grants, tried to bring attention to it through the Javits grants. And so those obviously affect what I was able to do, because I was able to get Javits grants. All of the Javits grants that I had in one way or another reflected that federal emphasis. So we did an AP grant, which was aimed at trying to serve students taking AP online who didn't have access because of the poverty of their school districts. We had another AP grant with Holly. I had another AP grant with Holly Herdberg, where we brought kids in from the Virginia Beach public schools, which was sort of a bridge program to AP. So we had the AP teachers from Virginia Beach come to UVA, and then we brought in groups of kids, and they worked for 3 weeks with the kids to prepare them for the AP classes they were going to take in the fall. Another one of our grants was the rural grant that I just finished up with Amy Azano. It's rural poverty. So the federal government gave me the opportunities with funding to pursue things that were happening in the field theoretically, were happening in schools socially, and were happening politically, as people looked at gifted programs and said, this isn't right, we shouldn't be able to tell a gifted program because all the white middle-class kids are in that room and everybody else is back in the other room. And so that political recognition and the federal government response to that, to fund programs that would try to find solutions to those problems in one way or another. I think those influences, I don't think they were just opportunistic. I think they were not just for me, but for all the people who got Javits grants, really attempts to translate those early thinkings in the field into something that would help kids. It ultimately would filter down by programs or curriculum, whatever it is we were doing in the various projects, whether it was in science or math or language arts, whatever we were doing. And I think that reminds me of one other thing, and that is, I really think that I have come to think over time, based on my program evaluation experience and my own curriculum writing experience, that gifted education made a big mistake for a long time. And this was changing right after I came out of my program, of thinking about thinking as absent from content. You know, for a long time, gifted hung its hat on thinking skills or higher level thinking skills or creativity, or all of it absent from language arts, math, science, and social studies. And I think the movement to reintegrate content into gifted programming or gifted curriculum is a major thing that I saw that evolved from my evaluation work, that the stuff that was going on for gifted kids wasn't really challenging. It was different, and everybody could say what they were doing was different than the regular classroom and the regular curriculum. But my evaluation work kept showing me over and over, this isn't having a significant impact on outcomes for kids, not helping them be better scientists, English writers, mathematicians, whatever it might be. And I think, and if you reflect back on Joe's work in the enrichment triad model, essentially he was saying that you don't just have kids working to be better, higher level thinkers. You want them to be professionals in a field and excel in their field. And you do that by virtue of them learning those skills, but learning those skills in a context.
Right. So the intelligence, the entity idea about intelligence without application has maybe, it sounds like you believe it's led us astray a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So I hear a lot of responses there. I hear a response to the theory developing, as you pointed out. I hear a response to political pressure as the politicians are brought to bear for what might be a cultural shift in our understanding of capacities and who should and is not identified. So a lot of those, there are a lot of different threads to pull on to try and affect the direction of scholarship, is what I'm hearing from you. Would you feel comfortable speaking a little bit on whether you think we've improved in our ability to respond to the needs of learners? If our theory has always been in advance of practice, in particular in reaching underrepresented populations, do you have some sense that we're in a better place now than we were, or do you think we are fighting the same battles we have been for decades?
I would say,
or does that question not even make sense?
I would say we are in a better place than we were in many ways. There are many school districts that have taken this issue seriously and have really tried to make a difference in their conceptual thinking about who belongs in gifted programs. I don't want to use the word programs anymore either. That bothers me. Who should get services that are different from what other kids get? Because program always leads us back to that room down the road, and I don't want to think that way. But I think a lot of people have been thinking seriously about where's the best place to do this, under what circumstances, and for whom. And I think those conceptions have broadened considerably, and I think efforts have been made, both because people want to, and sometimes because the government, Department of Justice, Office of Civil Rights, state attorney generals, whatever, have said to them, do it. And I think one of the good things about that is when they do it, it works okay. And then they say, oh, it's okay. The resistance is, I think, broken down when people realize, oh, these kids are doing just fine. These kids being the kids that they didn't want there before. I think we have a history that is really inhibiting. I had always thought that I think words are very important. Just words have all kinds of meaning. I never wanted, this is a bad revelation perhaps on my part, I never wanted to abandon the word gifted, not because I like the word gifted, but because every time I saw the word done away with, services were also done away with. People need a label. Whether this is human nature or whether we learn this, I don't know. They need a label in order to say there's something in need here, or there's something we should do here. I'm not any longer tied to the label. I just want people to recognize that there are a group of students who need challenge beyond what the ordinary curriculum provides for them, and need levels of support in terms of their development that aren't ordinarily provided. So I guess our history gets in the way because the word gifted gets in the way. The conception of what goes with the word gifted gets in the way. Like I mentioned, that place down the hall where these kids go is not the intention of having a gifted label, or should not be the intention of having a gifted label. So I think we're in many ways our own worst enemy with the label and the history. On the other hand, I see actually a lot of shining star spots. That one that I'll mention, which is obviously in court still, but I think it's going to work out. The Thomas Jefferson High School for Math, Science, and Technology really have made incredible efforts. But what happens when you make those efforts and another population loses seats in a school, those people then become angry and want the seats that the new population is getting to go to them. In one school I was working with this lawyer in this school, and we were meeting with all these focus groups, and depending on which group you were meeting with, you would hear different stories. And I said, it's not us. We just need to put them all in a room and not let them out until they figure this out, because their value, I can understand all of them. I have understanding of where each of the groups is coming from. Not one of them can understand where the other group is coming from. And so I can go from one group to another, but until they talk to each other and come to some resolution in terms of philosophy and belief system, this is going to go on forever. And so I think I've worked with some school districts that have actually turned around the representation and doing really, really well. I also will admit we have a lot of people, not a lot. I would say we have a significant number of people who don't want to change because it means they have to do things differently in their classes. And we can talk about culturally responsive teaching. We can talk about whatever. But if I've taught Shakespeare in 5th grade for 27 years, which you shouldn't have been doing anyway, because kids aren't old enough developmentally to make any sense out of that. But I've been doing Romeo and Juliet in 5th grade for however many years. And now I'm going to have a very diverse population for whom it's not going to be really fun, and it's not going to be engaging, and it's not going to be
relevant.
I have to come up with new curriculum. I have to come up with a new way of approaching kids. I have to come up with a new way of integrating. And I will say that there's a generation of teachers who probably I'm going to be glad they retire, because they fight change and doing the extra mile that it will take, doing the extra load of work rather than mile that it will take for them to be able to respond to the children who are coming into their rooms now, who are from different cultures, different language backgrounds, different experiences, different belief structures about the world. And so how do we help teachers who are willing to do it make the changes in what they do with those kids? And it's not even coming into my classroom, it's in my classroom in general. I'm dealing it with every other kid, but I can't say, well, the gifted kids, that doesn't matter, they're all the same. They're no more all the same than the rest of your classroom is all the same. And so that orientation also keeps us from moving forward as fast as I would like. I have also gone to conferences where it could have been 1960 when I walked into some of the sessions. People are talking about characteristics of gifted, which are on those old checklists that were developed in 1960, and they're showing me curriculum that was developed in 1960, and they are still out there. And I can't deny that, but I also go into sessions where people are really doing, as Amy calls it, place-based curriculum. Amy Asano calls it place-based curriculum, where they're really acknowledging the place from which kids come in the development of the curriculum that they offer and in the services that they offer. So I guess I'm saying it's pretty uneven, that in some ways we've moved forward, in some ways we've moved nowhere. The one thing, which is kind of heretical, I think, to say, is that I do worry that we lose sight of the fact that while we worry about identifying underrepresented populations, the highly represented populations haven't gone away. So if we do have middle-class white kids in our gifted program, we can't forget them either. And so we have kids who we're doing talent development with. We can't forget the kids who are advanced. So the field seems sometimes to me to bifurcate. You either believe in talent development or you believe in the old way of gifted. Well, I don't think those don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can say, very interested in talent development and uncovering talent in every population. At the same time, we're interested in talent development in every population, whether it's an underrepresented population or a highly represented population. And the field hasn't, maybe we reflect the politics in the nation in general.
Yeah.
That people have to be put in a room where they're not taking a stance for their people, but rather, how do we work for all kids? How do we make sure that all students who have special needs get special services? And we've moved all kids forward instead of, I'm advocating for this population, you're advocating for that population. We can't do both. We can do both, and we should do both. And I think that's where the field hasn't really come together to integrate those ideas. I think some of what Paula and Rena and Frank did in their talent development model tries to pull that back together, but that doesn't, it's almost too sophisticated for most people to understand. And our field also has a problem in translating the really good philosophical ideas into action. And I think that's where we're not doing as good a job as maybe we could do. I think I've gone way beyond your question.
Oh, that was amazing. And of course, astute and comprehensive. And you know, when I train teachers, one of the things we talk about, especially in teacher leadership program, is about politics. And anytime you have two potentially different agendas and constrained resources, you have politics. And teachers don't go into the job looking for political action. They think they've escaped it. And as it turns out, as Trotsky said, you may not be interested in politics, but the politics is interested in you.
Yep.
So the idea of elegantly and in a sophisticated way dovetailing these two or multiple agendas together so that we are not fighting for the scraps of funding to serve different students, I think it's a glowing vision. Yeah, and there are some great work being done out there. I remember, by the way, with crystal clarity, the time when I was arguing as a doctoral student that I thought gifted as a word was getting in our way and that we should ditch it. And you made a very cogent case that when that word goes away, service often goes away. It just very readily follows. And so finding a solution for that, I appreciate that you think that there is a solution for that maybe now. So. Okay, I don't want to keep you too long, and there's a question I am kind of dying to ask you. So as I noted earlier in the interview, our format is going to be about generational influence. And so we're going to be interviewing you. We're going to be interviewing your former doctoral advisee, Jonathan Plucker, who's also responsible for an incredible body of work in the field and was past president of NAGC. And then we'll be interviewing one of Jonathan's doc students, Ann Rin, one of her doc students, Lindsay Lee. And so you have spoken a fair amount about Joe Renzulli, and I appreciate that. It's always nice to hear, once again, about the formative influence that he had. And we will be asking Jonathan, when we interview him, what was Carolyn's impact on your early career and the framework through which you approach gifted education? And I wonder if you care to hypothesize about how Jonathan might characterize that influence.
Aside from staying out of his way. Well, I think probably if I had to identify anything, the first one would be the area of creativity. I mean, Jonathan came to work with me because I was doing work in creativity at that particular point in time. And he had obviously had a burning, and continues to have, a burning interest in creativity, and is incredibly productive. It's gone way beyond my thinking in terms of the area of creativity, particularly theoretically. And so I would say the fact that he had the opportunity to do some things with me in the area of creativity might be one of the things that he would say. I think the other thing he might say is his emphasis on evidence-based practice may have come from working with me. I think I tried really hard with doctoral students and tried really hard in my writing and really hard in my consulting work to tell people that they should be acting on the basis of evidence, and that gifted education often does not. It is not evidence-based. Otherwise, more kids would get accelerated. I mean, acceleration is the one area in which we have tons of evidence of effectiveness with certain kinds of gifted kids. Nobody wants to accelerate because they have all these mythologies that are not evidence-based about what happens to kids that are accelerated. And so I think Jonathan might mention evidence-based practice. He and I have written a little bit on that, so that makes me think he probably associates that with me to some degree. Evaluation, but I think he took evaluation to a policy level. I mean, he did work with me on evaluations and continues to do work with me on evaluations, but I think the stuff he has done in the area of gaps, achievement gaps, may have come from an evaluation base, working in the area of evaluation, but taking it to a level of looking at large databases and policy. That might be my influence. You might not think so, but it might be my influence. And the other thing I think he does, and I don't know whether that's because of my influence in the evidence-based thing, is to try to get people to behave in ways that follow evidence, not just tell them the evidence. I heard him give a presentation one time on language used with state superintendents to get them to listen to what he was talking about. And I had to reflect on how he had taken that notion of telling people what we know to a level that is telling it in ways that they listen to what we know. I don't know. I don't know where he would go with what he had in his doctoral program, but those would be three things I would hope he took away from his doctoral program. I can only hope, right? The things that I admire that he's done that I want to take some credit for. How's that? I want to feel like that. Some of what he has done in those areas has come from some of the experiences he had in the doctoral program.
So funny, I realize now that question is a bit of a Rorschach test, right? It's a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, we shall see. Great. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up with a final question then, and feel free to speak. You have spoken a fair amount on this already, but now for sure, three times we've tapped on this idea of the theory and research moving forward well, in what seems like a productive way for learners, and the challenge of translating that into practice in the presence of those learners. And I wonder if you have any final thoughts on ways in which that is most effectively done, or if you care to maybe highlight a moment in your professional history where you saw that done particularly well. And any advice for how we take the good research work being done and then turn it to the use more effectively of the people working with the learners?
Let me start with what I see as the roadblock to that, and that is, I hate to sound so political today, but the world right now is having a hard time believing in evidence and truth. And I think my biggest challenge, all 50 years, has been to work around people's belief systems when they're contrary to what the evidence says. And your question reflects that difficulty. How do we translate what we do learn from research into people's practice? So, one of the things I think one of the ways I have found success is when I've been able to translate and give people in practice real life stuff to use, not ideas. So I believe that the frameworks that Joe Anzuli and Sandy Kaplan and Carol Thompson have developed for curriculum are extraordinary in terms of theory and ways of thinking. Teachers can't do it. They can't do it unless you can give them a curriculum that they can use. And I believe pre-differentiated curriculum has a lot of evidence. The William and Mary units, the CLEAR units, the units developed in math at UConn. There's a lot of evidence. Those are all based on those other theories. But to just go in and say, here's the school-wide enrichment model, go do it. So I don't see success in that. We did a whole project on differentiation. We worked with teachers for 5 years, teaching them Carol Tomlinson's model. They loved it. They didn't do it, but they loved it. When we gave them the CLEAR curriculum, which is developed, which are language arts units that they can actually go into their classroom and apply that model without them having to go get all the materials, do all the thinking about the pre-testing they would have to do, all the assessment they would have to do as they went along, all the ways of scaffolding the work. If we give them the model of doing it, they can go do it. So my observation has been when I work with people and I can give them stuff that they can go use and see the success of it. Same is true in identification. When I can sit down with the school district and we can actually work through an identification model, and then we can go apply it. And that happened with the Rural Poverty Project. We went in with a model. We did all the testing. We sat down with them and did all the identification with them. And all of a sudden, the nature of the kids that were identified were different. Kids did great in the services they were offered. But it was because, well, I want to sound like we were doing it with them. We weren't doing it to them. The same is true of when I talk about pre-differentiated curriculum in the rural model that we were just working with. We started out by doing fidelity. We wanted to see if the teachers were doing the instruction we gave them. But what happened was we kept modifying the units based on what the teachers were telling us. I can't do that in my classroom because, and so we would modify the lesson and then they could do it. But I think when research gets translated into real stuff they can use, and they have the opportunity to provide feedback on that stuff so that it's usable to them, then I think practice changes. The same thing happens with identification. We say, you have to do universal testing of all second graders. We can't afford universal testing of all second graders. How could we make the pool smaller, but not lose the kids we're going to lose? So if we can work with them on that question and still not lose the basic universal testing screening process, but be able to apply universal screening in a way that makes sense, then we're more likely to get it to happen. So I think I think all research gets better used when people work with people on the implementation with as much concrete direction as you can give them. I mean, we can walk into a staff development, we can inspire people to heaven or to hell, whichever happens. But if we can't say, okay, now this is what it looks like in the reading lesson you're going to do, then they don't do it. They go out very happy and admiring of the idea, but I've still got that state standard I've got to teach. The kids are still going to be tested on those standards. What do you expect me to do? So I think that for me, I think the rural project we just did was the best example I've seen of us being able to translate the thinking about curriculum, about identification and curriculum, matching those together, and then working with the teachers to make the practice fit what they can do and the model at the same time, or the research. We had the research from the National Research Center project we'd done. So we knew it worked, but we had to get it to work in that setting with those teachers.
So what I hear you saying, the message I'm hearing as a fundamentally a mid-scholar or mid-career scholar is we shouldn't underestimate the time and energy it takes not only to collect evidence and generate theory and practice, but we also should be committing ourselves to then the translation of that practice until it finds a seat. And I can see where that would double or triple the estimated time to, right? It's not just about producing, as you said, produce the article, go conduct the P.D, maybe drop the keynote, and then walk away is maybe a model we might be thinking about. And I hear you saying that's half the work.
And I think it was Howard Gardner who talked about the people who are the idea researcher people, and then the people who make things happen. And it might be that you as a researcher can't do it, but if you've got a partner who can, and I think we haven't thought about those kinds of collaborations very often. So maybe I've got a great model and I can write the curriculum, but I can't work with teams. I can't make that happen, or I don't have the time or the, I don't know, inclination to want to make that happen. But if I've got a great partner who can make that happen, I mean, maybe that's also another way to think. I was just thinking about COVID vaccines. You can develop a vaccine if nobody will put it in their arm. What good is it? And so those people who developed the COVID vaccine don't have the ways to get people to put it in their arms. So there had to be another group that was going to make that happen. And I think maybe people in research and education should think more intensely about, I don't just write the article and hope somebody reads it and translates it into practice, but maybe I consciously build my research program so that there are people who work with me who have that capability to translate this and sell it after translation to people who will in fact do what it is that needs to be done.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you so very much. Anything else you want to get on tape before we close up the interview?
No, just thanks for having me and doing this. It was fun to do.
Well, you're brilliant. I really appreciate your time, and I do honor your career and what you've done for the field. So thank you very much. We'll get this posted. We'll talk to the other progeny and see how that works out.
Great.
And yeah, with appreciation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.